Today I would like to offer you 12 literary vintages of the horror variety. 12 short tales of terror that you can enjoy like a fine wine or single malt whiskey over the course of these cold, phantom-filled autumn nights. And like wine, these literary vintages are reflective of my personal taste. I have curated them for you, but there are still objective markers of quality. These stories are extraordinary. They're all intoxicating, and great literature, like great music and great art, can take us to a higher plane, can pull us up out of ourselves, but it can also serve as a heady intoxicant. And the stories I would like to recommend to you today do a little bit of both, but ultimately they unnerve us. Some of them may outright frighten us. Some of these stories may make it more difficult for us to turn out the light before we go to bed. And indeed, some of them may even help us to understand those parts of ourselves that we would rather keep confined to the shadows. Now, before we plunge into this curation of some of my favourite horror stories, I think it's worth keeping in mind the distinction between horror and terror. And this distinction was most significantly outlined by the sublime Anne Radcliffe, whose Mysteries of Udolpho did much to set the template for Gothic literature. Anne Radcliffe said of the kind of stories that she and Matthew Lewis were writing, she said that these kinds of stories could operate predominantly in a realm of terror or horror. Terror is the top shelf stuff. Terror is essentially that feeling of dread that precedes the horrifying or frightening experience. It's the feeling of dread and anxiety. It's that unnerving feeling. Horror is the feeling that follows the experience of revulsion, the horrifying experience. Terror is what you feel in the lead up to discovering the dead body. Horror is the feeling of revulsion once you have chanced across the body, maybe even touched the corpse down in a dusty crypt. Stephen King, writing on this subject in his marvellous Danse Macabre, said, "Terror on top, horror below it." And lowest of all, the gag reflex of revulsion. I recognise terror as the finest emotion, and so I will try to terrorise the reader. But if I find I cannot terrify, I will try to horrify. And if I find I cannot horrify, I'll go for the gross out. I'm not proud. In addition to noting the distinction between horror and terror, I also see three overarching flavours of horror, if you like, with many different shades and permutations. I see individual horror stories as being preoccupied with either dodgy doctors, the vampiric, or the ghostly presences. Now, dodgy doctors, those stories essentially explore the idea of man playing God, or man versus nature, and they're very much in the tradition of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, one of the most influential horror stories of all time. And then we get to the vampiric. Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla, Bram Stoker's Dracula, of course, alongside Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, is one of the most influential horror stories of all time. The vampiric archetype seems to explore both fear and desire side by side. We've had vampire stories or some manifestation of the vampiric in every culture for a very long time. Vampire stories are wonderful when it comes to psychological readings, Freudian readings, psychoanalytical readings. We can interpret the vampire quite endlessly. We can see the vampire as a shadow figure, if we want to talk Jungian psychology. We can see the vampire as an archetype for the narcissist, and many more different readings are endlessly available to us when it comes to the vampire. And when it comes to the vampire, there is of course a relationship with the ghost and the ghostly. The oldest form of horror story is that which deals with ghosts or ghostly presences. Again, every culture has a plethora of ghost stories, and we have long been obsessed with possession, hauntings, haunted houses. Why? Well, Carl Jung, speaking of reincarnation and rebirth, said that the very fact that we have the concept so significantly in every single culture speaks to the fact that it must, on some level, exist. Now let's dive into my recommended short stories. I won't be outlining the plot extensively and I won't be spoiling these short stories, so you can use this discussion as a primer before going into these stories, or you can enjoy the discussion after you've read them. Either way, we're going to be talking about these stories in the abstract and why I love them so much. And I would really love to know not only which literary vintages on offer here today you choose, but which short horror stories and short horror fiction generally would you recommend? It's a great excuse to talk about one of my favourite subjects, horror. Now, let's dive into the first story. Okay, this first literary vintage comes from 1816 and the maker is E.T.A. Hoffmann, a highly influential 19th century German romantic writer. The story is called The Sandman and comes from Hoffmann's 1816 Night Pieces. Hoffmann's influence runs deep in the world of psychoanalysis, cinema, painting, even ballet and opera. Now the reason I love this story so much is because it gives an extraordinary sense of what Freud would call the uncanny or the unheimlich. And it's the sense of the uncanny that gives me personally the darkest kick when it comes to these sorts of stories. I love feeling a sense of the uncanny. Now, what do we mean when we talk about the uncanny? Well, 100 or so years ago, we would talk about the uncanny in reference to waxworks and dolls. We would talk about automatons. And indeed, today, in the age of the machine, we talk about what Masahiro Mori called the uncanny valley. It's the sense that something's not quite right, not quite human. Something's not quite there, something is off. You know, when you see a doll and it looks very lifelike, but you look into that doll's eyes and something is missing. That is the feeling we call the uncanny. And it's not just horror literature, but literature generally that deals with the uncanny, the strange and estrangement. Great literature estranges us, and it estranges us because it gives us a sense of otherness. Shakespeare makes us feel at home in a strange world. So that's a kind of estrangement. Tolstoy makes us feel alien in a familiar world. That's Tolstoy's art of estrangement. One of the really strange things about literature generally is that stories frequently, but not always, stories frequently try to pass themselves off as reality. Fiction is frequently mimesis, it's imitation, yeah? It's a mirror held up to us and held up to nature. But when that mirror is held up to nature, it is a selective mirror. And when that mirror is held up to us, it is a distorted mirror. And maybe we willingly give ourselves over to the tale. There's a Coleridgean idea that's really useful in contemplating our relationship with fiction. We willingly suspend our disbelief. Essentially, we make a pact with the writer. We say, look, get the fine details right, get the things that are factual that we can prove correct, and then I will allow you, or I will permit you, to take some liberties with your fantasy. I'll buy into the more fantastical. And sometimes, especially when we're primed for it and we're in the right mood, stories can do a really marvellous job at passing themselves off as reality. Have you ever been reading a story and you have so willingly given yourself over to the fiction of the world that when the real world intrudes, you jump? It shocks you, doesn't it? Somebody calls your name or reaches out and touches you, and you are yanked out of that fictive world and you realise that what you were reading was not real. And then you get an overwhelming sense of the uncanny wash over you. I'm not going to say anything about the fine details of the plot of The Sandman because I would really love you to read it and I wouldn't want to spoil the surprise, the twist. But there's a sentiment in this story that I really cherish, and it's this idea that the most terrifying things are projections of our minds. And indeed, doubting whether we are sane or not is far scarier than anything we can encounter in the external world. This story, The Sandman, if you read attentively, paints master strokes of the uncanny. Not just because of the central action of the story, but because of the exploration of the ideas that external evil actually springs from ourselves, from our interior, and evil figures are phantoms of our own self. Our next literary vintage comes from 1894 and is Arthur Machen's The Great God Pan. Now, the 1890s is a fine decade for Gothic literature. The late Victorian writers utilised the Gothic form to explore many of the concerns racking the population during the fin de siècle. This was a decade of decadence, decay, and degeneration. A decade in which the moral value of art was up for intense debate. Could a book be morally good? Could a book be evil? This was also a century which saw a magical revival. Magic in response to the age of science. And we start to get this intense questioning around how far science can serve us when it comes to matters religious and mystical. Can science make us see God? Can a small surgical incision in the little grey matter allow us to see beyond this world? And indeed, what lurks beyond this world? That which we can see, that which we can perceive with our eyes, our senses. Are there evil spirits lurking beyond the physical forms? To quote the dodgy doctor in The Great God Pan, I say that all these things, everything you can see outside the sky and the trees, nature, everything that you can see is but dreams and shadows, the shadows that hide the real world from our eyes. There is a real world, but it is beyond this glamour and this vision. And we see in the age of decay and degeneration a preoccupation with how far science can serve us when it comes to the spiritual world. And indeed, I definitely don't see science and the mystical as being completely antithetical. We might say that the new mysticism is quantum mechanics or quantum physics, and I believe it was Richard Feynman who said that if you think you understand quantum mechanics, you don't understand quantum mechanics. There's a lot of really bizarre thought experiments going on in that incredibly difficult to comprehend field. Quantum mechanics seems to be the exploration of the idea that our thoughts really do create reality, or at least our perception influences it. And that doesn't seem so far away from the mystical world or the spiritual or religious world. But those are just a few ideas that I find myself mulling over when I reread The Great God Pan, and you absolutely should read it. The atmosphere is brilliant, the prose is very crisp, the pacing is marvellous, and it's also sensational and caused quite a bit of controversy when it first came out. This is a really great one to read around Halloween, especially if you like the sort of story that involves dodgy doctors and you like thinking about the mystical. This story is much anthologized and very easy to get a hold of. You can get it in this Oxford World's Classics edition of late Victorian Gothic tales, which has many other great stories too. But let's move on to my next recommended literary vintage. Okay, the next literary vintage I would like to recommend to you comes from 1895 and is largely out of print and criminally underappreciated. So we need to get this vintage out from the crypt, we need to blow the dust off its label, and we need to read this story in the early hours of the morn with a concession that it is going to possess us. The story is John Mead Faulkner's The Lost Stradivarius. Now, I came across this story in Halloween of Michaelmas term during my first year studying English. I found an old dusty volume in Oriel College Library, and around that time I was feeling very alone. Now, if you've ever tried to ingratiate yourself in a new school, or if you've been to university, you'll know that that first year is frantic, it's chaotic, and many of the people that you meet during your first year or the first few terms are not necessarily the people you will develop friendships with. And so, by the end of October of that first year, I was exhausted, it was tiring, and I was feeling rather lonely, and I came across this book. And this book kept me company. And suddenly I didn't feel so alone anymore, but it was an unnerving sense of companionship. The tale possessed me. Dare I say, haunted me. The story is about 100 pages and the atmosphere is absolutely brilliant. It's really evocative. The pacing is beautiful. It's really masterfully written. The story is about a young man who discovers a Stradivarius violin. Now, if you know anything about violins, you'll know that Stradivarius is reputed for making the best violins ever. And playing this Stradivarius violin, created during the maker's golden era, summons a ghostly spirit. It summons the spirit of the man who once owned it with disastrous consequences. Now, one of the many reasons I love this story so much is it turns my mind onto the fact that we are frequently possessed by art. Music possesses us, not the other way around. And when one thinks of flow states, for example, when you really get into the flow when it comes to your art or vocation, you are possessed, aren't you? It feels as though something is working through you. Maybe it feels like you're channeling a spirit. And if indeed it does feel that way, you would hope that the spirit you are channeling is benevolent rather than malevolent. And when it comes to our art, we want to hit those flow states, but very often we pay a heavy price for doing so. And this is another great story for those of you who are interested in the 19th century magical revival, magic as a response to science. Remember that the 19th century was the age of the Great Exhibition. Great exhibitions across Europe, like the one in 1851 in Hyde Park. This was the age of the railway and the Industrial Revolution. This was an era of soot and dirt and smoke. And there were many people feeling as though there had to be more. There had to be something beyond all of this. And one of the sentiments of this story is this idea that we're on the precipice of discovering something through art rather than science that will take us through to the next level of our evolution, for want of a better word, or consciousness. If you enjoyed Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray, then you will love The Lost Stradivarius. It's a story anxious about dark, illicit pleasures and explores that idea of whether art can be morally good or morally bad. What do you think? Can art be good? Can art be evil? Can a piece of literature be evil? Now, this is a story that we're going to discuss in depth at the Hardcore Literature Book Club. We're going to be talking about ghosts and the occult and evil spirits. We're also doing a reading of Bram Stoker's Dracula, and we're exploring the Gothic and the vampiric, and it's great fun. If Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is more your thing, we also have content on that masterpiece too. Now, speaking of Frankenstein, let's move on to my next recommendation, another Dodgy Doctor story. And this vintage comes from 1886, and it's a novella by Robert Louis Stevenson called The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr Hyde. One of the marvellous things about this story is the fact that Stevenson thought it so horrific, too horrific, to see publication, and so he threw it, cast it into the fire. He burnt his manuscript. Luckily for us, however, across 3 nights of cocaine-fueled rewriting, he got the story down on paper again, and we can learn from it and enjoy it today. Dr. Jekyll and Mr Hyde, along with Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and Bram Stoker's Dracula, is one of the 3 most influential horror stories of all time. And it's really not hard to see why it was so popular. A couple of years after publication, Ripper Fear hit London, and sensationalist tabloids preyed on the fears of their readers with a new kind of villain, the serial killer. Now, Stevenson's story is marvellous because it explores not only the idea of the monster outside, the monster lurking in the fog and the mist, the external monster, but it also explores the idea that the monster is within us, that we all have a monster lurking within. And speaking of this monster lurking within, I cannot help but reuse a Solzhenitsyn quote that I have used to death at this point, but if you have a perfect quote, why grasp for another one? It's this idea from the Gulag archipelago that the line separating good and evil passes right through every human heart. Stevenson, in Dr. Jekyll and Mr Hyde, says man is not truly one, but truly two. Now, we've long had this anxiety that as humans we are essentially tightrope walking between beast and God. We're partway between the two, and we can fall and we can plunge to the primitive and the primal and the beastly, or in very privileged moments we can climb to something higher, something that transcends our corporeal form. One moment we feel incredibly powerful, and the next we feel powerless, we feel helpless. And indeed, one moment we may feel evil, and the next we may feel benign or divine. Sometimes we have a small Hyde residue within us, small amounts of the evil impulse. Other days we're mostly good, and many days we seem to be a blend of the two. Dr. Jekyll and Mr Hyde is also a great story for Freudian readings, and indeed Freud himself really appreciated the Gothic, and we could even say that Freud's 1899 The Interpretation of Dreams was the last great 19th century Gothic text. A Freudian reading of Dr. Jekyll and Mr Hyde will see Dr. Jekyll as the ego, civilised, surface, respectable, and Mr Hyde as the id, impulsive, animalistic drive and desire. But ultimately I think a reading of Dr. Jekyll and Mr Hyde can serve us if we're amiable to the fact that the line separating good and evil runs right through every human heart, including our own. Next, we have an 1887 French vintage from a wonderful winery called Guy de Maupassant. How's the wine analogy holding up for you? Is it still working? I actually find with Guy de Maupassant that Colin Wilson's analogy of his short stories being like oysters, I find that to be a little bit more accurate, because you eat oysters by shucking them back. You have several, don't you? You have a platter of oysters and you enjoy many over the course of an evening. And that's the best way to enjoy the short stories of Guy de Maupassant. You're supposed to shuck many of them back side by side. And though I personally cannot stomach oysters anymore after the worst food poisoning of my life, luckily I can just about stomach the stories of Guy de Maupassant. And this story is called The Horla, which details one man's descent into madness. It's also a vampiric narrative too. Now, I really love those stories that detail a descent into madness, although love perhaps isn't the right word. Stories like Charlotte Perkins Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper. The reason I find these so unnerving is because they hit really close to home. They hit close to home with a fear that I think we all share. The most frightening thing in the world, I think, really is losing our own minds. We feel, don't we, intuitively, that regardless of what the world throws at us, and it can certainly throw some really difficult things at us, as long as we have our own sanity, maybe we'll be able to muddle through. But we lose this, and all bets are off. We lose everything. The Horla is all the more unnerving for the fact that it is one of Guy de Maupassant's last great stories and foreshadowed the writer's own descent into madness. Guy de Maupassant, as you may know, was a syphilitic and would lose his mind towards the end of his life. The Horla is also an epistolary narrative, and if you know something of my personal taste in stories, you'll know that I'm a sucker for the epistolary. Stories like Wuthering Heights, Bram Stoker's Dracula is an epistolary narrative too, Samuel Richardson's Clarissa. The reason I like the epistolary, which is letters or correspondence, diary entries, newspaper clippings, that sort of thing, is because you have suspense built in. And in addition to the inbuilt suspense, you also have an inbuilt intimacy. You get to really know the narrator. Now, I think another reason why the idea of madness or losing our minds terrifies us is because we can all to some degree relate to it. Even if we have all of our faculties, all of us have lost our heads. Look at the language we use, the metaphors we use. I lost my head. Yeah, we have all had those moments of madness, and then we come back to sanity and we think, wow, I had no control. What did have control? Where did my will go? Did the will of something else take over and work through me? Even if we have all our faculties, if you spend any time examining your own thoughts or even the things you say, you may find that many of the things that flit through your mind are not you. Where do our thoughts come from? Well, when you examine your thoughts, you'll find that they come from childhood, they come from the media, they come from perhaps your parents, your friends. Our minds are filled with voices that are not our own, and our identity actually lies closer to a realm of quiet and stillness if we can silence those thoughts that run through our minds. Again, looking at some of the language we use, my thoughts spiraled out of control. Who are we really? And it's terrifying to pose that question to ourselves, to ask that question in the dead of night, and perhaps for a moment find that we have no answer. Now, speaking of being alone in the dead of night, in addition to being terrified of madness or losing our minds, we're also scared to be alone, aren't we? That's a really primal, primitive fear. And there's a great line in the Horla that goes like this: when we're alone in solitude, we people the void with phantoms. And it's so true, isn't it? When we are alone and we feel a presence, what is that presence? Is there really something else there? Or is it a projection of our minds? Is it wishful thinking? Is it a manifestation of our own fear? We people the void with phantoms, and we all have ghosts. We all have those things that took place in our past that lurk in the dim recesses of our brains. And there was a painting that I saw some years back, Ghosts in a Tree, and I came to this painting and I found myself instinctively counting the ghosts, very much like Lewis Carroll confronted with a marvellous painting from a scene of A Midsummer Night's Dream. He started to count the fairies, and I started to wonder, why am I counting the ghosts? And I thought, maybe I'm counting my own ghosts, and maybe in the act of counting those ghosts I'm trying to get a handle on them. If I asked you to count your ghosts right now, how many would you have? Now, you might instinctively think, I'm not even going to do it, perhaps because you're scared about what you might find. But if you do count your ghosts, you might find you don't have as many as you thought. When we turn away from the thing that we fear, it grows in size, but if we look it in the face, we get control over it. And very often reading these stories has great therapeutic value because we are vicariously experiencing our own deepest fears. Now, my next recommendation is a bit of a strange one because it's not technically a short story, but it most certainly can be read as such, and I see this as being a really brilliant example of the Gothic. And this short slice of the terrifying comes from Walter Pater's studies in the history of the Renaissance, and it is Pater's description of the Mona Lisa as vampire that haunts me. I love this description of the Mona Lisa. Walter Pater, by the way, would be a strong influence on many of the late Victorian Gothic writers. Many of the writers who rejected the notion that art should have moral value. Walter Pater was the one who told us that all art constantly aspires to the condition of music. And if you want to pen really brilliant aesthetic appreciation, I would highly recommend studying what Walter Pater does in his descriptions, his appreciations of artworks from the likes of Leonardo da Vinci. He gave us this beautifully vampiric description of the Mona Lisa. And simply saying Mona Lisa makes you summon that enigmatic smile, doesn't it? And we cannot help but wonder, what is behind that smile? And I believe that this aesthetic appreciation, which is kind of like a Gothic story in miniature, helps us get closer to answering that question. Pater describes the Mona Lisa by saying she is older than the rocks, among which she sits. Like the vampire, she has been dead many times and learned the secrets of the grave, and has been a diver in deep seas, and keeps their fallen days about her. What makes this passage Gothic? Well, the Gothic is all about the secrets of the grave. You can tell a Gothic story if antiquated spaces feature, crumbling structures, abbeys, castles, ruins, that sort of thing, but these antiquated spaces have the secrets of the past haunting about them. And the Gothic always, despite being set in the past, has things to say about the contemporary. The Mona Lisa seems to know something age-old. The wisdom is in that smile, and if we could only decipher it, perhaps we might learn something that could save us from harm today. Now, whilst I'm being a little bit esoteric in my choice of short horror fiction, let's recommend a poem. And this poem comes from Emily Dickinson. Now, I love the poetry of Emily Dickinson, and I see much of her poetry as being intensely Gothic and exploring many of the concerns that Gothic writers would explore in the short story form. Emily Dickinson truly did give us some of the best poetry ever committed to the page, and her poems are frequently like diamonds. They're very compressed. Every word has many different nuances and different shades of meaning, and we can store the poetry of Emily Dickinson in our minds. We can possess the poems, and then they can possess us. Now, the poem that I would like to recommend to you is one of her most famous poems, Because I Could Not Stop for Death. He kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. This poem is a journey, and we are in the carriage with death, and we are journeying towards eternity. And we see, as we ride through this carriage, and it feels as though this is a metaphor for our journey through life, we pass a school and school children at play, and that's a very unnerving feeling, this idea of riding with death past a schoolyard. And it is simultaneously a real schoolyard, and so contains the idea that death is just lurking around the corner in areas that we would rather it not, but it's also the school of our own childhood. We slowly drove. He knew no haste, and I had put away my labour and my leisure too, for his civility. Helen Vendler has an extraordinary exegetical analysis on this poem. Helen Vendler, who's done much to explicate the sonnets of Shakespeare and the odes of John Keats, and she turns our attention to the fact that when this was published in 1890, the editors excised a stanza, because in that stanza there was a sense of this journey perhaps not being a volitional journey, a journey towards heaven that we embrace, but one that we fight. And that is one of the many unnerving things about Emily Dickinson's poem, is this idea that we are all journeying from cradle to grave, and somewhere along the way we realise this. We know this, we know we are approaching death, and we are approaching eternity. And yet we fight it. Perhaps we don't go willingly into the light. Perhaps we are scared and we want to stay here. Now, as we move into my next recommendation, you may notice that it has gotten darker. You may discern the sound of the rain and the thunder outside. Maybe we have aroused some evil spirits in our discussion. Maybe they don't like what we're discussing. But we will forge on. And my next recommendation to you is Polidori's The Vampyre from 1819. Now, is this John Polidori's story, or do we have Lord Byron to thank for this story? I really do like the atmosphere and the descriptions in this short vampiric tale, but the reason I really like rereading this one is because it always places me in a pivotal moment in literary history. This story was born out of the same fertile soil that gave life to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. We have Percy Bysshe Shelley, Mary Shelley, Byron and his physician Polidori holidaying on Lake Geneva during the year without a summer, and confined to their abode with wind and rain buffeting the landscape, they challenged each other to write some horror stories. Mary Shelley terrified them all with Frankenstein, and we get this tale of an aristocratic vampire from Polidori and Byron. Now, there was an intense debate as to the authorship of this story, which would go on to be incredibly influential. I do see Byron as having a little bit of a hand in the story, though the influence of Byron is more obvious in that he seems to be something of a model for the aristocratic vampire. This tale is really important when it comes to the history of horror literature because it marks the time in which the vampire became aristocratic. Now, why is that so important? Becoming aristocratic meant the vampire was now mobile. The vampire could now go on grand tours across Europe, and the vampire was no longer just a creature that would feed on livestock. The vampire could now move across vast distances and could lurk among us. And the fact that the vampire became aristocratic also goes some way to understanding the sexualization of the vampire. Okay, the next tale I would like to recommend to you is another turn of the century work. It's the 1898 Henry James story, The Turn of the Screw. And this story fits into the tradition of governess tales. And towards the end of the 19th century, we see that governess tales were incredibly popular. With Henry James, we see a writer who was straddling two traditions, the late Victorian and the early modern. And Henry James was reacting against the so-called realist writers of his days, and he railed against the loose, baggy monsters, the novels of Tolstoy and Charles Dickens and George Eliot, and he thought that they had too much extraneous detail. Now, whilst I would personally disagree with James on that, his story is remarkable for the fact that he moves away from omniscient narration, the kind of omniscient narrator who we can see is essentially battling it out with their characters. When you read these big Victorian novels, the characters have really distinct and individual voices, but so does the omniscient narrator too. And sometimes we wonder, who is speaking louder? Who do we hear come through most clearly, the characters or the narrator? And with James, we move away from that, and we also move towards an unreliable narrator, which is a brilliant device when it comes to horror fiction. Couple that with a frame narrative and you've got something really compelling on your hands. And with the turn of the screw, we have the Gothic hallmarks, and we also have intense suspense. And if you read the turn of the screw the way it came out, if you read it following the original serialized publication schedule, then you'll be reading this short story, essentially a novella, over the course of many weeks, and the story will start to haunt you. You'll start to feel ghostly presences. It will work in the background of your mind, and work is the right word, because Henry James doesn't give us any answers outright. He wants us to be active. He wants his readers to be complicit, and he wants his readers to work through the story themselves. And The Turn of the Screw is another story that we can read through many different lenses. And indeed, I think of Maud Ellman, who, speaking of Bram Stoker's Dracula, said that when it came to the vampiric, we are all endless interpreters. And this is true for ghost stories too, and it is certainly true when it comes to The Turn of the Screw. Readers most certainly can change their interpretation of this tale year after year. Our relationship with James's story is anything but static and clear-cut. It is fluid and ever-developing. And indeed, the lack of a clear denouement may frustrate many readers. But when it comes to this story, we must push away that more digestible, easy pleasure, and we must work at it. We must flex our imaginative powers, and we must put a lot of our own personal investment into the tale. Because when it comes to this story, you really are the one responsible for piecing it together. And that's why I love it so much. Now, let's try a modern vintage from a British maker. From the 1952 story collection, The Apple Tree, the story is The Birds by Daphne du Maurier, a favourite of mine. You've almost certainly seen the Hitchcock film, or you've seen clips of it. Daphne du Maurier is always rewarding to read. Her Rebecca is a splendid representation of what the Gothic can do in the 20th century. Now, you probably already know the story of the birds. England is under attack by kamikaze birds, and the story is set just after the Second World War. But I think it's certainly clear what these birds are referencing. The descriptions are chilling, the atmosphere is anxiety-inducing, but the thing that most moves me is just how truthful this story feels. There are some really chilling passages that describe the radio broadcasts going silent for the night. This story is not really about birds bombing us from the sky, though indeed that would be terrifying and we certainly wouldn't stand a chance. It's not really about the natural world turning on us, but rather us turning on the natural world and us turning on each other. This story is heavily influenced by the machine war and the trauma that arose from that war. And indeed, it's true that without suffering, we wouldn't have great art. Theodor Adorno asked, after Auschwitz, how can there be poetry? Something to that effect. After the atrocities of the world wars, how can we ever celebrate life through art again? Well, the answer is suffering and pain and trauma leads the way to great art. And we see just how damaging the world wars were, how much trauma that inflicted upon our collective unconscious in stories like Daphne du Maurier's The Birds. And that's what makes this a truly terrifying horror story for me. Now, keeping with the modern vintages, let's segue into Shirley Jackson's The Lottery. Shirley Jackson is another favourite of mine. If you want some longer fiction, I would highly recommend The Haunting of Hill House. But this story, The Lottery, this speculative fiction, which we could call dystopian, but I would say this is horror through and through, or indeed, if we're keeping with the Radcliffean definitions, this is terror, really. This is another post-war story. It comes from 1948 and is once again riven through with post-war anxiety. Anxiety about the collective, mob mentality and scapegoating. The experience of reading The Lottery is the experience of mounting dread and there is a twist. And some critics have said that the lottery does not sustain rereadings because of the twist ending, and I won't spoil it for you in case you haven't read it, but I reread the lottery every few years, and even though I know the outcome, I am still consumed by that feeling of terror and dread. And indeed, we do frequently demand a delicious twist from our horror fiction. I think of the stories of Roald Dahl, who's always great if you want a good twist. But the lottery gives us something more than just a twist. It doesn't matter how many times I reread it, it really gets under my skin. And indeed, the lottery certainly got under the skin of many first-time readers who cancelled their subscriptions to the New York Times, which published the story. It also resulted in a ton of hate mail, and the story was even banned in some places. Surely the story wouldn't provoke such a response if it wasn't giving voice to some uncomfortable truths. To paraphrase Oscar Wilde, the reader's dislike of realism is the rage of Caliban seeing his own face in the glass. Now, the last vintage I would like to offer you this evening comes from 1902. It's W. Jacobs' The Monkey's Paw. Now, this short story, and indeed it is very short, you can read it in probably around 10 minutes. Remember the distinction that we spoke about between terror and horror, and Stephen King's aims when it comes to terror and horror. Well, King holds The Monkey's Paw up as a quintessential tale of terror, because it's all about what the mind sees, the unpleasant speculation that terrifies us. The Monkey's Paw is a moral tale of sorts, and indeed much of great horror does spring from folklore, it springs from old wives' tales, and gives us a warning, some sage advice that we are undoubtedly going to ignore. The story is something that you're probably already familiar with. A monkey's paw can bestow upon you 3 wishes. Now, if you had 3 wishes right now, what would you wish for? And much of horror does deal with the psychology of wishes, and a lot of horror is wish fulfillment, but a perverted sense of wish fulfillment. The moral of this story is one that we hear all the time. It's embedded in the old proverbs and cliches. It is wisdom gifted to us from our ancestors, and indeed we ignore this wisdom because we only learn things the hard way. The warning is this: be careful what you wish for, because it might come true. And so, you might think, well, if I had 3 wishes, I would wish for this and this and this. But if we heed this ancient wisdom, we should then turn our thoughts onto the question of what would happen if we snapped our fingers and our wishes suddenly came true. Our wishes came true without any work or effort or pain or struggle on our end. What would happen if we skipped all of the process and suddenly had an extreme change of lifestyle dumped in our laps? Well, of course, there would be many problems attendant upon the fulfillment of those wishes. Thank you very much for surveying some of these fine literary vintages with me today. I hope you have found 1 or 2 to your taste, and I would really love to know what short works of terror and horror you would recommend. Let us know, and happy reading, everybody. Sleep tight.